before any further ado, just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone joining us today from across the globe, and those of you who will be watching this afterwards as well. We are here to talk about 5 insights ambitious software developers should know. We all work in some way related to development and large projects. And I think that post-COVID and with various projects kind of racing either to catch up or to get started, the opportunities in front of developers couldn't be wider. Meaningful then that we're having a conversation today with 2 folk who can cast a light on where developers can focus their time and energy to become even more impactful in the projects that they work on. My name's William Cass. I will be the host for today, but the real stars of the show, of course, are Christopher Caruk, CEO at Clockworks, and Maria Forte, Project Success Specialist at Pegasus. With that in mind, Christopher, could you kindly introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Christopher Caruk. As William mentions, I'm CEO of Clockworks. But I think for the purpose of this discussion, more important that I've been an engineer for the last 35 or so years, and worked on a variety of projects, everything from radically embedded systems to large-scale distributed systems, of course, many different kinds of web-based systems, embedded systems, payment systems, financial systems, etc. And so have good experience working with a great number of developers over the years and interviewing a lot of people for a lot of different kinds of jobs, and seen a lot over my time.
Perfect, Chris. We look forward to pulling on some of that experience as the day progresses. And I pass the ball over to you, Maria. Hi, Maria.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. As William mentioned, I'm a project success specialist at Pegasus, and my main focus is to oversee the recruitment process. And over the years, I've been successfully identifying and placing developers in multiple projects. So I'm keen to show you all what are the improvements you can make to your own interviews and hopefully land that role that you are dreaming for.
Awesome. Fantastic. So thank you very much. With that in mind, then we have 5 kind of key points. I think the best way to go about it is to go one point at a time. Kind of makes sense, right? 5 at a time would be a little bit too much. So 1 at a time, and we can spend 4 or 5 minutes on each one. That would be great. So without further ado, and helping us set a little bit of context, Chris, you've had a pretty long and prestigious career, and you've seen the technology stack change over the years. I wonder what does that mean to the typical software developer?
Well, if I could say anything about the changes over the years, I would say that the more things change, the more they remain the same. There tends to be a kind of cycle within computing and engineering where old ideas seem to come back again and again and again. For example, early days, of course, programming was done in assembly language, native assembly language for a target CPU. And of course, later languages like C evolved, which were one layer above assembly language, but intended to compile down to assembly code. Later, interpreted languages came, and of course, through interpreted languages, we saw the rise of Java, PHP, Python, Ruby on Rails, all of these languages that involved an interpretation layer where the language itself was abstracted out and then converted to machine code within the virtual machine or the interpretation layer. And these days we seem to be going back. Now for very high performance systems, we have languages such as Rust and Go, even to some extent, which are more targeted at native architectures. So again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Likewise with databases, very early days, early forms of databases were all based on a network model. Of course, later in the 80s, things evolved. The relational type databases were developed. From there, we went to object stores, where the persistence layer is more of an object storage mechanism rather than a relational database. But now I see we're much going back. You look at projects like Node.js, for example, which use what is more like a network model database to store the relationships between individuals. Again, the more things change, the more they seem to go back or remain the same. Early days again, virtualization. I don't know if many people in the audience remember or have heard of VMS. VMS was a very early operating system for mainframe computers, and it was all about virtualizing applications within private environments. Of course, everything there went to standalone systems, and of course, from standalone systems back to VMs. And now, of course, we have a smaller, lighter form of VM or something similar to VM in containers. Generalized components to highly specialized. I think here, because of the way the computer industry has evolved, we've gone from extremely generalized components, tools that can be used for pretty much anything, to extremely specialized tools. Now, it's very true in terms of databases, where initially we would have a relational database and you would have to structure your data in such a way to make it work within a relational data store. These days, as noted above, you have object stores that can be used to store object-related data that's far less structured. You also have name value pair key stores, technologies such as Redis, where you can store related pieces of information as a set of name value pairs. You have tools such as Neo4j that allow you to store very efficiently the relationships between people. So I think these days it's super important to pick the right tool for the right problem. Don't try to use a relational database where an object store is required, and by all means use a network model or a database that stores relations rather than an object store where that's most appropriate. And I'd say also important not to be taken in by fads. I see very often, because object stores are very popular and everybody seems to be using them, people try to solve relational database problems using an object store. Right? And just because relational databases aren't in fad anymore doesn't mean that they're not the right solution for particular problems. The other major change, of course, is in support tools and automation. I can't remember, I can't count the number of times I sat through interviews and people very proudly told me that they used Notepad to generate HTML or to write their code. They felt that this was a kind of badge of honor. But these days we have just an incredible array of extremely good tools for helping people develop software. I think you're a bit of an idiot if you don't avail yourself of these tools, learn how to use them and learn how to use them effectively. And finally, I guess this goes back to perhaps a decade ago, where everybody was talking about the benefits of OS X versus Linux versus Windows, and everyone had their favorites and everybody argued about which was best. And I'd have to say, those days are over. Really, just like picking the right tool for the job or picking the right services for the application that you're writing, you pick the right OS. You pick an OS that is suited for the kind of problem that you're trying to solve. All of the OSs that are around are good. They have their strengths and their weaknesses, and it's important to understand those strengths and weaknesses to make a good choice of what to use in a particular situation.
Perfect. Many thanks, Chris. That really does give us a much better idea of the context in which we are now operating in, or in which developers need to not only find projects, but enhance skills as well. With that in mind, we go over to the second question, which is to you, Chris, and then the third one is to Maria. But the second one here really is around thinking about the technologies and languages developers should focus on to get involved in more interesting projects. Quite a wide question.
Right. Well, this was an interesting one because, of course, there's two elements to it. There's what's popular and what do people like to use, and what's actually going to make you the most money when coding. I think ultimately if you want to maximize your returns when working as a developer, you want to kind of be on either end of the spectrum. You certainly don't want to be using what everyone else is using, or at least taking the approaches that everyone else is approaching. You either want to be at the very cutting edge and working with newer languages, or working with something that is very old, where skills are potentially a bit rare. And so when looking at the kinds of languages people should focus on, I tried to consider both. Now, the first, of course, probably the most popular language in the world right now, aside from HTML and CSS, is JavaScript. JavaScript is used everywhere. It's used on front-end websites, and of course, using tools like Node.js, it's used on back-end systems as well. It's extremely flexible, extremely fast, extremely powerful, and I think important that everyone have a grasp of JavaScript. Second, excuse me, Python. Now, Python isn't the fastest language in the world. I think we all know that. But of course, it's extraordinarily flexible and really easy to use. It's also compatible with Windows, OS X, and Linux, and so can pretty much be used everywhere, and is used very often in systems integration, back-end development, data sciences, application development. So I think extremely important that people have a grasp of Python and understand how to use it. We find that a lot of our clients, a lot of our work is around systems integration, whether it's integrating logs from various systems, integrating applications. An awful lot of work these days done in Python. HTML and CSS, well, of course, the world is built on the web these days, and so really good idea to have a grasp of HTML and CSS. And alongside CSS, some of the compiled or interpreted variants, SS, for example, where you have higher level constructs that could be applied against your CSS style spreadsheets. I think really important to understand how they work. Java, again, like JavaScript, is everywhere. It's used in larger scale applications in e-commerce, finance, application development. Because Java can be a little bit difficult to work with. The skills or good Java programmers are paid well. SQL and NoSQL variants, of course, queries are handled differently. And I suspect that most of us know how to structure a basic query in SQL. But it's important to know more about SQL than just SQL, understand how to assess or analyze queries when working with them, know what works well and what doesn't work so well, know what parts of the SQL language are efficient and know which parts are not efficient. Likewise, NoSQL. NoSQL has a very, very different structure when it comes to querying data. So important to understand and appreciate the differences. And if you have an opportunity to work with something like MongoDB that uses JSON to generate queries against the NoSQL database, very good thing to know. And then, of course, beyond that are languages such as Cypher that seem to be up and coming. Node.js uses it to structure queries for its network model database. C#, if you are developing under Windows, C# seems to be the language to know and understand. It's used in game development, desktop, web, mobile application development. C# programs are paid well. There seems to be a lot of work out there. Now, Rust is a new one that I think is important for everyone to have a sense of how it works and what it does. Rust is a natively compiled language that's used for operating system development, VR development, where performance is key, and of course, web development, again, where performance is key. It's an extremely interesting language, very much structured like C and C++, but with much more elegant typing built into it. Perl, this fits into the category of something that perhaps isn't very popular anymore, but of course there are an enormous number of systems that have utilities that have been written in Perl, and so Perl skills are short. We see lots and lots of people looking for people to maintain Perl code, and so it's well paid, good one to know. Finally, Go. Go has become extremely popular in the last number of years for system network management and system network utilities. It's used a lot in containerized utilities that you see pretty much everywhere because it handles networking very, very, very nicely. Also used in audio video editing applications, and of course, big data for big data analytics. So I'd say these are the main ones to focus on. I've specifically excluded languages like PHP. I think because there are just huge numbers of PHP developers out there, and so consequently the work is not as well paid as these other languages. Does that help?
It certainly does. Thanks, Chris. It's all about focusing on the extremes of the spectrum. Is that right?
I think so. If you're looking at maximizing your returns, you want to look at either the cutting edge or the older languages, but also looking at where the demand is.
I understand. Okay, well that certainly makes a lot of sense, and that kind of builds me to my next question before I move over to you, Maria, and extending that. Well, I suppose we looked at languages. What about skills?
Well, skills are a difficult one to pin down. I think mostly it's about the attitude you have toward the work that you do. And so first and foremost, I would say in everything you do, be an engineer, not a tradesman. There are lots of developers around, not necessarily self-taught, but people who think that, okay, I'll learn how to do this and I'll earn big money because it's very, very popular. I think that's really not enough to be a proper engineer. To be a good developer, you have to develop proper engineering disciplines. You have to have a commitment to documentation as you code, a commitment to the structure of your code, the commitment to making things very readable, a commitment to testing, making sure that you build testing into whatever you do. And so I'd say, really, in all ways, be an engineer, not a tradesman. But I think having said that, it's important not to become too rigid, right? You don't want to always take tried and true approaches to things. It's extremely important to be able to think laterally about problems, to be able to think at a higher level about what's going on. And there, I think you want as an engineer or a software developer to have a good understanding of all aspects of a system, because of course, when you're building applications, you are orchestrating the activities of the entire system that you're working on. So it's important to have a good understanding of what's going on in the network. It's important to have a good understanding of what's going on in storage, in the server itself, to understand how they work. I see these days a lot of programmers, they've never even opened up a computer. They wouldn't recognize any of the parts inside a system. And I think it's important to have a really good understanding of the tools that you're using to ply your trade. Automation, GitOps, of course, extremely important skills these days. Systems are becoming increasingly complex. And so if you can't employ tools to help you manage that complexity, you'll be lost in it. When given the opportunity, pick the best tools for the job. I mentioned this before, but that not only includes languages and operating systems, it also includes things like your own tools, your IDEs instead of notepads, which I noted earlier. And I'd say the other key skill for engineers is deductive reasoning, problem solving, puzzle solving. Work on your puzzle solving skills, because ultimately resolving issues in code or in systems is all about being able to very rapidly deduce the source of the problem and then figure out what you need to do to fix it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Chris. That I think that gives us a really good view of the skills and attributes of a developer from your perspective. And I think understanding it from your perspective is important. Chris, for those of you joining us on the call today, has well over 30 years of executive leadership experience spanning all sorts of organizations and complex development projects with many hundreds of developers, right down to only a couple of developers. I think the span of your experience is very broad, and I think being able to see just a brief summary of that experience was really, really powerful, and thank you. I'd like, if I can now, to move the ball over to Maria, who I think takes a slightly different view of the industry and of the skill sets of software developers. So Maria, when we started the conversation, and for those who are arriving a little bit late to the conversation, you of course work in talent management and talent acquisition, if I'm not wrong. And so you must work through a tremendous amount of hiring processes and think about software developers and their skills in a very, very different way to Chris. And I think this would be a great opportunity to ask you both, what do you see out there, and where are folks struggling?
Yeah, indeed. So I've, over the years, interviewed many developers, and there's some common aspects during this interview process that I feel like people struggle with, and that I listed here. I guess the first one, and the one that I feel is key, it's soft skills. This one is often neglected. And what I mean by that, I mean that you should really focus on conveying your soft skills to the interviewer. So you should show enthusiasm and interest in the project or the company. But also you should, for example, pick a relevant project that you worked on in the past. And instead of focusing exclusively on the technical stack that you use or the technical requirements, really display your soft skills used in that project. So how efficient was your communication with the customers? What were the strategies that you used to communicate with your teammates? How did you approach problem solving within that project? All of this will give the interviewer a broader insight into your skills, not just the technical ones, and it will score you many points when going through the hiring process. And then, of course, I guess this is the obvious one, is preparation, right? You should definitely prepare for the interview. And how can you do that? I would say start by really understanding the company that you are interviewing for and its technology. Really go for it, Google it, understand what technical stack they use, because this will give you then context to prepare some meaningful questions for the interviewer, for example. And those questions can be aimed into the technical side of the company, but can also be a bit more generic. For example, what are the day-to-day responsibilities within the role? And by the end of the interview, it's even okay to ask, can you give me some feedback, right? Because that shows that you are interested and you really want to get that role. You want to portray that to the person that is interviewing you. I would say, as a preparation, really important also to focus on an intro about yourself. This is surprisingly a very common mistake that people do. They don't prepare an intro. They go onto the call and then they give you a super large description about their CV. We don't need that, right? We have the CV in front of us. So we really want you to be insightful, but be really concise in the way you explain who you are in that first minute. I would say a minute is more than enough, because then you will have time during the interview to go a bit more in depth about your other skills, because we will ask you questions, right? So you can then go a bit more in depth. But that first minute is where you grab your audience, right? So you should really, really work on that. And then, of course, know your audience and adjust your answers. Now, what do I mean by this? And maybe I should give you a bit of context around the recruitment process that we usually follow. We start with an intro call, usually led by a human resources person, and then a technical call led by a software developer. Now, if you're having a call with a human resources person, it's probably that that person is not a technical person. They don't really have a technical background. So you should really adjust your answers and maybe play up your soft skills during that call instead of focusing too much on the technical aspect of your CV. And if you are then interviewing with a software developer, then you should really go for your technical skills and really go more in depth about them. And lastly, I would say that you also want to adjust your answers depending on the job description. So get that job description, study it, and then from your CV, really pinpoint what are the skills that are relevant for that role. And in that way, you can really focus on those during the call. So if you are, for example, a developer that is proficient in Python and Java, but the role is for a Python developer alone, then that's the skill you want to really go for during the interview, right? That's what you want to showcase. And that's, in a nutshell, I would say preparation, context, and soft skills are really the key for a successful interview.
There was a quick question while we were talking about whether people should talk about management skills. I think that's an interesting question.
Sure.
Of course, if you're looking for a position as a manager, then absolutely you should talk about management experience. But if you're looking for a position as developer, certainly highlight your leadership skills. I think that good leaders lead from the front. They're first and foremost good team players. And so they understand how to share their knowledge, share what they know to help people. They're interested in mentoring, again, all about sharing and collaborating with their team members. And so absolutely mention your leadership skills. Absolutely mention where you have helped instruct people, how you've helped them learn how to do what you can do. At the very least, if they're not looking for a team leader, you'll be in line for the job if you can demonstrate these skills later on, and it certainly adds to your chances of landing the job if they think you have potential leadership skills.
Yeah, I do agree. Maria, is there anything you wanted to add to that? As in, what's your view from a sort of HR standpoint?
No, I completely agree. Sometimes you are working in a team of developers, right? And maybe you are applying for a role that is for a senior developer that is leading a small team. All those skills that you have in management will help you land that role for sure, because they want someone that can really manage a team. Maybe if you have project management skills, also talk about that, right? You used Scrum before. Whatever did you use, it's really relevant for a role as a developer.
I'd say psychologically, though, you're probably better off calling them leadership skills.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not interviewing for a management position, then the interviewer might feel that you're overqualified for the job that you're going for. So if you talk instead about leadership skills, then that makes you perfectly qualified for a development role and gives you the potential to then go for something a little higher.
Absolutely. Perfect. Well, hopefully that has answered that question. Please let us know, the person who did ask it, if you have any subsequent follow-up questions around that vein. And I guess moving that forward slightly, we've talked a lot about communication, not code, I guess, for want of a better way of looking at the last kind of 5 to 10 minutes or so. Chris first, and then perhaps Maria. What sort of soft skills should developers be focusing on during sort of initial conversations with prospective employers and team members?
Well, Maria's talked a lot about communication skills. It's super important to be concise and to the point. We've had interviews with people where they go into long, lengthy descriptions of things that they did and not really give the interviewer an opportunity to stop and ask questions. That's a bit of a red flag when it comes to hiring people, because of course, if you're managing a team or you're project managing a team, you want people who can give you quick, sharp, short answers to questions. And so the more they go on about one thing or another, the less suitable they are, the less skilled they are at being concise. So of course, be communicative, but don't overdo it. I mentioned before about team play. Show that you know how to share, that you're not going to hoard knowledge to yourself. Really be a good team player. And I think I can't state too stressfully that it's super important to be a good team player. You just don't find many projects where just one person works in isolation. You have to work with the rest of the team, and you have to be a good, valuable team member. And that means supporting the team and understanding the needs of the team, but also doing things for the benefit of the team as well as for yourself. So really be a good team player. Relax and enjoy the interview. Nervousness shows up, but unfortunately, nervousness doesn't come across as you're being a little socially awkward. It comes across as you're not telling the truth about what you're saying. So really super important that you try to relax, try to convince yourself that it's not that important whether you get the job or not. It might be very important, but I think the more you can put yourself in the mindset that you could live without the job, the more relaxed you're going to be, and the more you'll enjoy the interview. And along those lines, try to smile, as you go through, try to show them that you're enjoying the interview, you're enjoying the conversation. The right fit for a role isn't always just about the technical skills. It's about who's going to fit in, who's going to be a good, productive, contributing member to the team. Remember that when you're talking to people, that not everybody on a call will be technical. Now, as Maria mentioned, initial calls are generally with HR people who are not very technical. And they're very often ticking boxes. They're looking for an understanding that you've got some experience in the areas that need to be covered by the technical people. When it comes to a technical interview, you will often have a project manager or a manager on the call together with the developers to kind of round out the group. And they're often not as technical as the developers. And so when giving a technical answer, watch the audience. If you see that there's some confusion, try to analogize, try to find a way to refer to something a little bit more common to explain what you're describing. And finally, I'd say avoid saying no. Better to say yes, but if somebody asks you if you have ever or have Python experience, okay, if you don't have Python experience, you probably shouldn't be and that's required, you probably shouldn't be in the interview. But if you work with it in university, if you work with it on a project, if you've seen it, if you've read about it, you can say yes, but these skills are not as strong as some of my other skills. I worked on it in this context and feel that I could come up to speed very quickly on what you require in that area. Be positive, avoid saying no.
Absolutely. And anything to add to that, Maria, before we move to our final and fifth point?
Yeah, maybe I would add one last point, and it's about don't be too modest. So you don't want to come across as arrogant during a call, but you also don't want to downplay your skills, right? You don't want to say that you have a little bit of experience or you worked on a small project. Just say a project experience, and because if you downplay your skills a lot, then you will come across as less experienced than you actually are sometimes. No need to do that. You want to sell yourself, right? So
sounds like an English problem. We always make things seem smaller in the interest of keeping everyone happy and not seeming too self-aggrandizing.
Yeah, Maria, you're right. It's a tough balance to strike between being over bullshit or over bold about what you're saying and underselling yourself. So yeah, I'd say like you avoid saying no, avoid using words like small or terms that indicate that the project wasn't very important. Perfect.
And my fifth and final question, and these questions of course have been selected because they're so regularly asked by wider team. We've obviously talked a lot about software development, some of the past and some of the current skills that folk couldn't do. I guess if we talked about the past, the present, we've only got to talk about the future next. And so I wonder, Chris, if we can ideate a little bit and start thinking a bit about what the technologies that will define tomorrow look like today.
Sure. Well, a lot of this is, of course, here today, and there's a lot of demand today over development of these kinds of systems. So I picked a number of areas that are both current and up and coming, where people should be at least doing some reading about what's going on, and if they can find a small project, perhaps an open source project to contribute to, dive in and start working on some of these things. So first and foremost, data analysis and visualization. Been around for a long time, enormous demand for people who can help make complex data more presentable. Augmented reality, and I'd say augmented reality more so than virtual reality. I think virtual reality is very much yesterday's news, although I think that there's still room for development in the technology. But I think our near-term future is going to be all about augmented reality, and lots of interesting things happening in this area. Embedded systems and Internet of Things. I put this one in because very often, if you're a developer who works on the Microsoft platform, then very often you won't give much time to understanding Linux. And when it comes to embedded systems and Internet of Things, Linux is everywhere. In fact, just yesterday I was reading an article on a new device called the Mango Pi. It's about the size of an SD card and includes a 4-ARM core CPU together with memory and really everything that you need to run a system. Much smaller than the Raspberry Pi Zero even. So these systems are going to keep coming. There's going to be enormous demand for developing applications for these kinds of tools. I think really important to understand. And if you don't understand Linux now, super important that you gain a really good understanding of how Linux works. Voice response systems, of course, Siri is everywhere. Alexa is everywhere. There are all sorts of technologies. Oh, there's Alexa going in the background now.
Is a trend for tomorrow, perhaps, how to stop Alexa doing that? Because I feel like that for so many of us. Yeah,
exactly. So learning how to work with voice response systems, I think, very important. This technology is not going anywhere. It's only going to grow. Containerization and microservices. Well, everything is moving toward cloud native. Everything is going to be web-based. I think really important that you understand how containerization works, how Docker works, how Kubernetes works, and how to build applications for this kind of architecture. More now than future, but understanding the difference between a relational database, an RDBMS, an object database management system, and a graph model database, I think is seriously important. At least for the very least, because you don't want to be making mistakes about the approach to take to building an application. And so you want to be well versed in the differences between them, and how to apply each technology. And the last one I put is something that might be a little bit further down the road, but all the same very interesting and very different in terms of how to approach developing, and that's quantum computing. I think quantum computing will revolutionize the secure transmission of data, and the analysis of data and the construction of models, how real world work. So it's a good one for future. Good idea to know what's going on there. I guess what I didn't mention as well that it's good to understand, it's the whole finance thing. I guess more for today than tomorrow, but finance technologies and understanding technologies like blockchain are pretty interesting today.
Thank you so much, I think, to get our heads around, Chris. And I think it's probably a good moment for us to kind of move to summary of some of the points that we've discussed so far. And I have to say, it's been quite an informative conversation with both of you as well. I think we started off, didn't we, with Chris talking about how the technology stack has fundamentally changed, but hasn't really changed. The core principles remain the same, but just the way that we deliver them has changed. Is that correct, Chris?
Yeah, I think really what I was trying to express is that the more the industry evolves, the more we seem to return to the way we used to do things. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. So good to keep your skills current, but always look back at the way things are done and try to understand the way things were done.
Fantastic. We then went and looked a little bit around and talked about how actually having skills at the extremes of the skill set and of those languages that are perhaps not as common be in the right place, just in terms of being able to find the right sort of ROI on your efforts to upskill. And we've also looked at how developers need to focus on the communication, not only the coding in their interviews and in their conversation with non-technical peers and colleagues. Is that fair, Maria? Is there anything else you wanted to add in summary to that?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, focus really on your communication skills, your soft skills, and really prepare for the interview. Read about the subject, the technology, the company, and make sure that you also know how to portray yourself. So really try to be concise and precise about your capabilities. Yeah.
Fantastic. And then we spent a little bit of time also looking at the getting to meet Chris's Alexa. But after that, also understanding a little bit around, what tomorrow looks like and what those technologies are going to be. And I imagine that when we do run this very much a conversation like we have done today, in 3 or 4 years' time, I wonder how many of those technologies that Chris mentioned will not be about what tomorrow holds, but what today is about. And so certainly look forward to mapping that as well. And I think that gives us a little bit of direction as well. So thank you to you for that, Chris. In closing, I suppose, and unless anyone has any final points, it's worth noting that Pegasus has a number of very active projects at the moment, and a very lively development team under the great stewardship of Christopher Caruk and his wider team. Please feel free to reach out to us either directly, now that we're all familiar faces on this call, or via our website. We'd love to hear from folk, even if it's simply just keeping in touch and networking, or for something slightly more tangible on one of the many projects that we're either running currently or about to lift as well. So with that in mind, any final points, Chris or Maria?
I'd say that if I were to say one thing in closing, and refers to, again, being that team member, or winning that job interview for the position that you want, it's try to be passionate about what you do. I think that many of us are developers because we actually like building things. We are engineers. So try to convey that you love what you do, that you're interested in what you do, that you're turned on by the technology, and always live to learn. Try to learn every day. Try to learn something new every day. Invest part of your time every day to picking up something new, something interesting. Keep that enthusiasm alive.
Profound words to end the day on. With that in mind, have a wonderful day and happy coding all.